Conscript is a fantastic survival horror experience, one of the best in years. I've said over and over that if you're looking for an old school survival horror experience, look to the indies. The best survival horror titles from recent years have come from the indie space. Alisa, Amenisa the Bunker, Crow Country, Darkwood, Signalis, Tormented Souls. You can add Conscript to that list, a title where a bulk of the work is from one developer, Mochi. Along with Alisa, Conscript got me to back Kickstarter projects again, after a long string of disappointments. I backed the project back in 2020 after playing the demo, a title I kept my eye on, waiting in the background in anticipation. These things take time. Was Conscript worth the wait? Yes, it is. It's funny, between the time of backing and now, we saw another survival horror title set in World War I, that being Amenisa the Bunker, the best game I played from 2023. Funny how that the best game I'll probably play in 2024 may very well be a survival horror title also using World War I as a setting. That said, they are very different titles. The Bunker was a more confined area, the World War I setting more of a backdrop, fending off one primary monster throughout. Conscript is about the war itself, the trenches, the underground tunnels, the countryside and town ruins. Conscript delves into the horrors of the Great War. It's a blending of old-school survival horror while pulling elements from more action-based horror titles, limited inventory and resources with interconnected level design. There is more combat, this is war after all, but where it pulls more from the action-oriented side is the addition of a merchant and a store, a currency system, one that adds a whole other layer to the decision-making process. I haven't come across another survival horror title that blends the store functionality with a more old-school survival horror design as well as Conscript. If you back Conscript on Kickstarter, enjoy it once your key is available. The wait was worth it. Thinking about purchase? Well, if you're a fan of what I cover on the channel, it's a no-brainer. Unless something else comes out between now and then that blows my socks off, it's the best game I've played from 2024. As noted, I did back the game on Kickstarter. A thank you to Conscript's publisher, Team 17, which provided me an early review key. I'd also like to thank the fellow Boulder Punchers who further support the channel through Patreon or a YouTube membership. If you'd like to support the channel further, consider joining your fellow Boulder Punchers on Patreon or a YouTube membership. You'll get early access to videos, be featured in the credits, receive periodic updates, and my undying gratitude. Conscript takes place in mid-1916. During the Battle of Verdun on the western front of France. World War I has raged for around 2 years at this point. We play as Andre, a young man amongst the many soldiers in the trenches. Not only fighting for survival in one of the war's longest and bloodiest battles, he's also searching for his missing brother, Pierre. Our journeys will take us through the trenches, underground tunnels, bunkers, along with the ruins of the countryside and towns. On the presentation front, Conscript has a couple of ways of standing out from other titles. One is using a top-down approach for its camera, one that's pulled a fair distance back. It's a similar approach to what Signalis did, but further back. The other way of standing out is with its graphics. The PS1 aesthetic is oh so common to see in these kind of games, and for good reason. But Conscript reminds me of something you'd find on Nintendo DS, or the later stages of the Game Boy Advance. There's something about its look and graphic fidelity that reminds me of that era. To note, Conscript uses the Game Maker engine, as opposed to Unity or Unreal. Conscript has us navigating through trenches, underground tunnels, bunkers, ruins, and more. It makes use of looping level design, unlocking shortcuts and doors locked from the other way as we go. A setting full of trenches and underground tunnels could be tricky to gather our bearings in, where areas can look the same. This isn't the eccentric Spencer Mansion or the Raccoon City Police Station. Yet there's enough distinction amongst areas to gather our bearings and get a lay of the land. A generous map provided doesn't hurt. One other way that Conscript adheres to old-school survival horror is through a limited inventory. Something you don't always see in survival horror titles. It's a tough balancing act to implement. I don't fault survival horror titles that forego limited inventories. Earlier this year saw the release of Crow Country, a fantastic survival horror title from the indies. One that didn't make use of a limited inventory. The interconnected level design was so strong I didn't mind its absence. But here it is in all its glory within Conscript. Every item takes up a slot, except the gun parts for upgrades, ink for saving, and cigarettes for purchasing items. The game is generous in how much ammo we can stack in the slot. We even have the option of increasing how much ammo stacks through purchasable upgrades. The game is also generous with how many slots we can open up as the game progresses, and you'll want to. Resource management is a delicate juggling act in Conscript. Some of the better I've come across in the survival horror title. Conscript is more bare bones on the puzzle side of the survival horror formula. Not to say they're bad, they're straightforward in finding the solutions. Most involve looking through notes, take the clues given, and search out the answers in the environment. The game's developer mentioned in a dev blog the difficulty of making puzzles while remaining grounded in the World War I theme. They're not as eccentric or as out there as you'll find in other survival horror titles. Of course, we're not alone in these trenches and tunnels. We'll come across German soldiers on the regular to deal with. Combat is simple, but brutal in its presentation and its execution. Most enemy types are melee based. We'll come across the occasional soldier with a gun. It'll take a bit more time to line up a shot, giving us time to get an attack in or get out of harm's way. There are basic soldier types that go down without much of a fuss. The ones with heavier gear and masked up take longer to kill. They're faceless, more inhuman, who seem more monster than man. There's one enemy type that makes a horse-like noise when you kill them. But the game will give us a stark reminder on the regular of who we're dealing with. Upon death, some enemies will drop a photograph, one of their family, their friends, their loved ones, young men like us who happen to be on the other side of the war. We have a few ways of dealing with our foes, either through fight or flight. One option for fighting is up close and personal with melee weapons. Wind up for more damage, in which you stand still. You can feel the impact of hits, whether dishing out or on the receiving end. The screen shake, the sounds, the damage dealt. Melee weapons have durability. Weapons that deal more damage will have lower durability. They don't break upon depletion. We can use repair kits to fix them up. Weapon durability is always a divisive mechanic, but it works well in Conscript. In a game full of trade-offs and limited resources, it's a perfect fit. When you're fighting other melee-based soldiers, you want to draw out their attacks, dodge, and get yours in, or hit them as they approach. You could dodge with a roll, which offers generous invincibility frames. This drains our stamina meter, although not by a lot. Stamina meter is more for sprinting, a feature I'm a bit more mixed about. It's not like our default movement speed is slow. It doesn't feel like sprinting is much faster. As well, it suffers from the oh-so-common issue with sprinting in games. Before we know it, Andre is hacking and wheezing, needing time to recover. We can upgrade our stamina throughout. We can also equip an item that increases our movement speed. One that didn't feel like too much of an upgrade, and one that burns up a precious item slot. There are a decent variety of guns at our disposal. Some we'll find if we do thorough exploration, others we could buy from the merchant. And a nice touch, some guns require the ejection of a shell before shooting your next shot. A delay that can give your opponent more than enough time to close the gap and get their attacks in. It's an additional layer that adds to the frantic tension of combat. In some cases, our shots will take them down, with death's door only half open. They're helpless, screaming out in agony, begging for death, which we can grant them. Another stark reminder of the horrors of war. We're fighting young men like us who happen to be on the other side. We don't need to fight enemies. We can sneak or sprint our way past them. There are pros and cons to this approach. Enemies will have recognizable patrol patterns that we could sneak around. There will be the occasional spot in the environment we could hide in. Enemy detection is visual based. We could sprint past them at full speed as long as you're out of field of vision, something that's a bit on the comical side. And some enemies' field of vision is quite limited. The tougher enemies with more gear and masks have limited sight. We ourselves deal with limited vision while wearing the gas mask to navigate areas full of gas. We can also make a beeline for a door to another area. Re-entering an area will reset enemy placement. Or you could sprint past them and time your rolls to get by without a scratch. But why would we want to avoid combat? While we have a limited inventory and limited resources, Conscript is generous with ammo, whether finding ammo in the environment or providing us with gunpowder to craft ammo. Some enemies will drop cigarettes, the currency we use at the store. That said, it's not a ton, and you're better off finding cigarettes through exploration. We'll be revisiting areas on the regular. Why not clear them of enemies? It's because you now have to deal with the rats. These little buggers are going to be the bane of your existence in Conscript. Rats will emerge after a certain amount of time to feed on the corpses left behind. But they also hunger for living flesh. Our flesh. They'll make a beeline for us. You could kill them with a well-placed melee attack, but they move faster than soldiers. You have little time to wind up before they're at our feet. You can sprint and roll past them, but they're much tougher to dodge than soldiers. They'll start chomping away at us, inducing poison. This won't kill us, but will weaken our overall stats. A pack of rats can make short work of you if you're not careful. To note, they only come after us. They don't go after living enemies in the area in what feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. We have a few ways of dealing with them. Of course, the simplest way is not leaving any corpses behind. Leave enemies alive and you won't have to worry about rats. Or toss a grenade into their hidey hole to prevent them from emerging. That said, this is only available in the game's early stretches. We don't have this option later on. But we do have the option of fire to deal with them, either through burning corpses or burning the rats. We can use a firebomb, an item we could craft to induce fire. Or we could use a lighter and fuel to torch the corpses. Using the lighter and fuel take up 2 of our precious inventory slots. One of the crafting items needed for a firebomb can heal us instead for another option. And while Conscript is generous with how much ammo you could stack in a single inventory slot, it offers little stacking with fuel. As well, you may have several corpses to deal with in any given area. Or you can wait for the rats to emerge and then torch them. But there is a brief delay upon dumping fuel on the ground, lighting the fuel, and having fire emerge. More than enough time for rats to run past the flame. You can lure them into it, but in some cases you have limited room. A narrow hallway may result in you rolling through the fire, taking some damage, but taking out the rats. It's this juggling act that makes Conscript such an engaging survival horror experience. There's always a pro and a con to each choice you make, something that carries over to other areas of the game's resource management. While Conscript can be more action heavy on the combat side, it takes more action horror elements with the addition of a store. We find cigarettes in our journey to use as currency with the game's merchant. I wasn't sure what to make of this at first when I heard this was going to be in place. Would it blend in well with the more old-school survival horror design? Would it blend with the interconnected level design, the limited resources, and inventory? The answer is yes. While other games have tried a similar blending, I haven't come across others that have managed to find the happy balance quite like Conscript has. It's one of the game's greatest strengths. The merchant is generous in his offerings, one that grows as the game continues. Many of the items sold we can find in our travels. But if you need something in a pinch and have enough cigarettes, you can buy it. We can use the gun parts we find or the ones we can purchase to upgrade our weapons. It's what you expect it to be: damage, reload speed, fire rate, and capacity. We can sell items to the merchant for cigarettes, although he won't offer much for most items. It's the rare items like gems and stones that he'll buy at a high price, or in this case, cigarettes. What helps make Conscript so compelling is all the trade-offs the game throws our way with resource management. Crafting items can have a few uses. For example, you can mix chemical fluid with gunpowder to create ammo, or combine it with a bandage to create a disinfectant, a means of dealing with the rat poison. We can buy items that increase our movement speed, improving dodging capabilities or improve healing. Yet these take up a precious item slot that we may want for something else. A trench torch provides a source of light. While we could get by without it, you'll have next to little vision in dark areas, in which there are many. The game is generous with how long the battery lasts before requiring a new one. The last thing you want is to lose your source of light in a dark area. You can equip body armor to soak up damage. That said, it doesn't take much before it breaks and requires a repair kit to fix up. As well, this eats up an item slot. Add in key items you'll need to progress, keys or otherwise, and before you know it, your inventory is full. You can save up cigarettes for an additional item slot you could buy from the merchant, but that may take some time. What about that small key we could purchase to open up that drawer we saw earlier? What can be within? You already have the delicate juggling act of resource management. What do I take with me on my next excursion? How many item slots should I leave open? Should I save now and use up ink, or save it for later? The game allows you to enable unlimited saves or checkpoints, but I didn't use these to get the more old school survival horror experience. And there were a couple of times where I wish I had saved instead of making another journey out. Add in the store option on top and you have layers upon layers of decision making. Some of the strongest I've come across in the survival horror title. You can see how much the game's developer has a strong understanding of how classic Resident Evil works. Yet, there are some tweaks to the formula that make Conscript its own. Of the classic Resident Evil titles, it's one of the strongest resource management systems I've come across in the game. This next bit does contain spoilers about the game's sections, which I'll try to keep as vague as possible. The game's first stretch is its strongest, as is par for the course when it comes to survival horror titles. The trenches and tunnels have a lot to offer. For example, you could find or purchase wire spool to reduce the number of enemy reinforcements. We could find artillery shells to clear debris in select areas. It's during this section we have the option to use a grenade to plug the rat holes, something we can't do in the game's later stretches. There's plenty of optional content worth seeking out for the rewards. This could be a new weapon, an upgrade, or items that sell for a high amount of cigarettes. There will be a time we move away from the trenches and more to the countryside, but we will return. In our journey through the trenches, we'll come across several doors we can unlock for a time, building intrigue for later when we return. The countryside section is more open than the trenches. It's less interconnected and more spread out. Once again, there's plenty of optional content we can do, offering us worthwhile rewards for our thorough exploration. That said, I'm more mixed on this countryside stretch. There's some downtime to take in the area at first, not having to deal with enemies. Of course, your warning bells are going off. Something is going to happen here. This area won't be safe for long. I mean, we are at war. There are short stretches throughout Conscript where Andre will have flashbacks prior to the war. Ones of home with his family, where we have short bits of exploration that fleshes out Andre's backstory, his family, and his relationship with his brother Pierre. Peaceful moments to take a breather. The thing is, the first stretch of the countryside section follows this flashback. You have to go through several areas and find a key item before the area fills up with enemies, and we can access other areas in the countryside. A downtime stretch that goes on a bit too long. I'm all for letting a game give some downtime, but depending on how you explore the stretch, it could go on what feels like for a bit too long. If that key item were in a more central spot, and or if you had sections blocked off in the meantime, it would have worked better. What also makes the countryside frustrating is the readability of some of the environments. In the trench, it was always clear where you could and could not go. There were several times in my excursions in the countryside where I'd hit a dead end. Was this a puddle I could go over, or too deep to cross? Can I go this way, or is this area blocked off? This led to a few cases of frustration in trying to navigate around. It's not a huge quality drop, something common in survival horror titles with later stretches, but one that's noticeable and notable. And this does make the return to the trenches oh so satisfying, now armed with new items and keys to unlock the remaining doors and access areas that were once inaccessible. A later game stretch takes us to the ruins of a nearby town. The game strikes a happy medium here between the trenches and the countryside, more spread out in the trenches but more interconnected than the countryside. Although I did find that having one more shortcut to loop back to some areas would have made it better. There were some backtracking stretches where I wish this was the case. And there's a sewer section that, well, is a sewer section. It doesn't help during this stretch my trench torch ran out of a battery, leaving me with little light for a stretch. And we'll make our way to an occupied fort after the town, one that's even more claustrophobic and narrowed than the trenches we started in, like a descent into hell. Conscript did surprise me with its game length. I thought I was reaching the game's ending stretch when I had a new area to navigate through. I mean this in the best possible way. It wasn't a case of the game wearing out its welcome. And while I did bring up my issues with the countryside and town ruins, the quality remains consistent and high throughout the game, something that even the bestest survival horror titles can struggle with. The story is more minimal in the background of Conscript. We'll get bits and pieces through the photos we find, the propaganda posters, the notes we'll come across. They are fewer than your usual survival horror title. The same goes for the characters we'll come across. In our journeys to find Pierre, we'll have brief chats with fellow soldiers. One highlight being Gaston, a man always looking to bum a smoke from us. The focus of the story is on the war itself, the other horrors and atrocities that man could commit during them. We'll find many soldiers suffering shell shock, PTSD, or in their own no man's land throughout. As mentioned earlier, some enemies come across more monster than human, but Conscript never goes to the well of conventional monsters. The monster here is war and what man can commit during it, something that differentiates Conscript from other survival horror titles. Amnesia the Bunker made use of a World War setting, but more as a backdrop. In Conscript, the World War I setting is front and center. And it's an experience that's well worth your time. Unless something else comes around to knock my socks off, I don't foresee a better title for 2024, survival horror or otherwise. Conscript continues the trend of the indies being the place to go to for new, quality survival horror experiences. Ones that pay lineage to the titles of old, but with their own unique twists. Few survival horror titles do resource management and trade-offs as well as Conscript. A game that has a wonderful blending of old-school survival horror mechanics while pulling elements from more action-based horror. If you're a fan of what I cover on the channel, it's a no-brainer. For Kickstarter backers, enjoy the game when you get your game key. For those that didn't, Conscript is well worth a purchase for a trip into the trenches. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel further, consider joining your fellow Boulder Punchers on Patreon or a YouTube membership. You'll get early access to videos, be featured in the credits, receive periodic updates, more goodies, and my undying gratitude.